They say that what you put into the world will always find its way back to you. For some, it's a whisper, a gentle reminder of the lives they've touched. For others, it's a reckoning, a force they can't outrun no matter how hard they try. This is the story of a man who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, but when karma comes knocking, there's no hiding. It doesn't forgive, it doesn't forget, and when it hits harder than you could ever imagine. Before we dive into today's story, let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video from? We'd love to hear from you. In a world that often feels as though it's spinning out of control, there are a few people who seem to carry a rare and precious light with them. Meet Ava. Ava doesn't stand out because of her wealth, her fame, or her status. In fact, you might pass her on the street and not give her a second glance. But if you looked a little closer, if you took a moment to notice the quiet kindness in her eyes, you'd see something different, something beautiful. Ava is the kind of person who goes out of her way to help a neighbor carry their groceries, the kind of person who remembers your birthday even if you don't. She's the heart of the neighborhood, always lending a listening ear or offering a warm smile. But it wasn't always like this. Ava's journey to becoming this kind of person wasn't easy. Her life hasn't been devoid of struggle, but through it all, she has chosen to respond with empathy rather than bitterness. She's learned the hard way that kindness is often the best armor we have against the world's cruelty. There, on the porch of the house across the street, stood Mr. Jensen. If Ava was the light of the neighborhood, then Mr. Jensen was its storm cloud. He was the kind of person who could sour a sunny day with a single word. His eyes were narrow, his lips constantly twisted into a frown, as though life had wronged him and everyone else had to pay for it. Mr. Jensen told, "Hey, you, I told you to keep that racket down. No one wants to hear that noise at this hour." Ava told, "I'm sorry, Mr. Jensen. I didn't realize I was bothering you." You see, Ava knew something that most people often forget in their rush to be heard or to prove themselves. She knew that sometimes the best response to cruelty isn't anger or retaliation. Sometimes the best response is silence. Sometimes it's the calmness of a quiet heart that speaks the loudest. But Mr. Jensen wasn't one to let things go. He didn't like being ignored, especially by someone he felt was beneath him. And in his world, people like Ava, kind, peaceful, and humble, were always the easiest targets for his anger. Ava's kindness wasn't something Mr. Jensen could understand. To him, the world was a battlefield, and he was always on the losing side. He carried his prejudices and anger like armor, and he had no patience for those who tried to heal the wounds life had given them. But Ava wasn't fighting a battle. She wasn't interested in the noise of the world. She simply wanted to make the world a little brighter, one small act of kindness at a time. And in a place like this, where everyone was too busy with their own struggles, Ava's light shone like a beacon of hope. Ava was an empath, and her superpower wasn't strength or speed. It was her ability to see the good in people. And even when faced with hatred, even when the world around her seemed dark, she held on to that belief. Because deep down, Ava knew one thing: what you put into the world always comes back to you, and kindness always wins in the end. On a day that felt as ordinary as any other, Ava's world was about to be shaken by something she never expected. Up until now, she had faced little more than the everyday challenges of life. Managing work, handling the ups and downs of relationships, and of course, tending to her beloved garden. But in a world so rife with division, Ava's peaceful existence was about to collide with a force far uglier than anything she could have prepared for. Mr. Jensen told, "Hey you, what are you doing out here? You don't belong on this side of town." It was in that moment, with his harsh words hanging heavy in the air, that Ava realized something she had hoped she'd never encounter: hate. Not the kind of hate that burns brightly in the dark corners of the world, but the kind that hides in plain sight. The kind that, until now, she had believed only existed in distant places or in stories passed down through generations. Ava told, "I'm just walking home, Mr. Jensen. I'm not bothering anyone." Ava was not the kind of person to engage in confrontation. She had spent years cultivating her inner peace, learning that most people who lash out are often struggling with their own battles, their own pain. But this wasn't just a bad day for Mr. Jensen. This was something else. This was racism, raw and unapologetic, and it wasn't just directed at Ava, it was a reflection of the world that still existed in the shadows of people's hearts. Mr. Jensen told, "You think you're better than us, don't you? Just because you come in here with your fancy clothes and your foreign ways, thinking you can just blend in. Well, you can't. People like you never fit in." Ava told, but now with more firmness in her voice. "I'm just like everyone else, Mr. Jensen. I'm not here to cause trouble, just to live my life. We all deserve respect, no matter where we come from." Mr. Jensen told, "Respect? Ha! You think we're just going to forget who you are? People like you don't belong here. You don't belong in this neighborhood. Go back to where you came from." In that moment, Ava's mind is swirling with 100 thoughts. She could walk away, pretend like it didn't matter, and let his words fade into the background like they always did for her. Or she could fight back, raise her voice, and challenge his ignorance head-on. But neither of those options feels right. Mrs. Thompson told Jensen, "Enough. What's your problem with this woman? She's done nothing wrong." Mr. Jensen told, "She doesn't belong here, Thompson. You know it, I know it." Mrs. Thompson, firmly standing her ground. "I don't know it, Jensen. I don't know anything of the sort, and I've known Ava long enough to know she's one of the nicest people you'll ever meet. You're the one with the problem, not her." Ava's heart aches as the words swirl around her like smoke. It wasn't the first time she'd been judged by the color of her skin, or the way she dressed, or the way she spoke. She had encountered prejudice in small ways before, comments made behind her back, sideways glances in stores, but this was something more overt, something darker. And yet, despite the pain of it all, Ava doesn't retaliate. She doesn't scream back. She stands tall, her head held high, her gaze steady. Ava told, "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, but there's no need to get involved. I'm fine." In that moment, something shifted within Ava. The kindness she had always given so freely, the empathy she had extended to every soul she met. It wasn't enough to protect her from the cruelty of the world. But as she walked away, her head still high, her heart still beating, one truth settled deep within her. The world would never take her light. No matter how hard it tried, she would keep shining. The sting of Mr. Jensen's words clung to Ava like the scent of rain after a long drought. The pain, though deep, was not unfamiliar, but this time something in her spirit refused to simply let it slide. Ava had always believed that kindness would win in the end, that the universe, in its infinite wisdom, would find a way to return the good we put into the world. But that belief would soon be tested, because sometimes, when the universe is watching, it doesn't just reward the good, it takes action against the wrong. Mr. Jensen, oblivious to the shift that had taken place, continued to nurse his resentment. He had no idea that karma, much like the wind, moves quietly until it hits. Sometimes, karma doesn't need to announce its arrival with trumpets or grand gestures. Sometimes it's as quiet as a gust of wind, unseen yet powerful enough to change the course of events. In that moment, Mr. Jensen's pride met its first blow, a fallen fence, a symbol of the disarray he had caused in his own life. As he grumbled, attempting to fix what was beyond repair, Ava stood at her window once more, watching the scene unfold. She couldn't help but feel a quiet, almost instinctual understanding that the universe had just begun its work. Ava wasn't one to celebrate the misfortune of others, especially not someone like Mr. Jensen, but even in her deepest sense of compassion, she couldn't ignore the subtle irony. He had spent so much of his energy trying to tear down others that the world had found its way to tear him down, without her lifting a finger. As the days passed, Mr. Jensen's luck only seemed to worsen. The neighborhood that had once felt like his domain was now becoming a place he could no longer control. Every day it seemed something else went wrong. His car broke down, the roof of his house sprung a leak, and the more he tried to maintain his tight grip on the world around him, the more everything seemed to slip through his fingers. Mrs. Thompson, loud enough for others to hear, "You know, Jensen, you can't keep ignoring what's right in front of you. Maybe it's time to take a look in the mirror." Karma was no longer working in the shadows. It had made its presence felt. Mr. Jensen's every effort to maintain control over his world seemed to crumble, piece by piece, until all that was left was the weight of his own bitterness, and the glaring truth that the universe had other plans for him. It wasn't that Ava was wishing for bad things to happen to Mr. Jensen. She wasn't, but she knew something that he hadn't yet learned. The things we put into the world have a way of coming back. And for those who spread hate, who tear others down without thought, there's always a cost, a price to be paid, whether they see it or not. Karma doesn't always come with a warning, it doesn't need to announce itself, nor does it wait for the perfect moment. It just arrives, quietly and without fanfare. But when it does, the world is left to reckon with its consequences. And when Mr. Jensen's day finally comes and he has to face the full weight of his actions, he will understand one simple truth. Karma doesn't forget. In the end, Ava didn't need to do anything at all. The universe had already set its plan in motion, and the balance it would bring would change everything. As life returned to its usual rhythm, Ava found herself once again at peace. The storm that had swept through her world seemed to have passed, leaving behind the calm she cherished. The days were quiet, the nights restful, and for a while it seemed like Mr. Jensen's misfortunes would remain a distant memory, a momentary flare in the otherwise peaceful lives of the neighborhood. But sometimes, when things are quiet, when we think the world is still, the universe has a way of pulling the rug out from under us, ushering in something unexpected, something strange. Ava's peaceful evening was about to be disrupted by a visitor who, like Karma, had been waiting for the right moment to show up. Who was this man? What brought him to this quiet suburban street at such a late hour? And more importantly, what did he want? It was then that the knock came, light, almost hesitant, but there. Ava told, "Can I help you?" Man told, "I need to speak with you, Ava. It's important." Ava told, "I'm not sure who you are, but I think you might have the wrong house. I don't know you." Man told, "You don't know me? No, but I know you. I know exactly who you are, and I know what happened, what you did." Ava told, "I don't understand. What are you talking about? Who are you?" Man told, "I am the one who makes sure the scales are balanced. I'm the one who sees everything, all the actions, all the consequences. You didn't ask for it, but I know what you've been going through. I've been watching, waiting for the right moment." Ava told, "What do you want from me?" Man told, "What you did was noticed. Mr. Jensen's actions weren't just harmful to you. He's caused damage to others before. People like you, people who've been forced to face the consequences of his hatred. But you didn't strike back. You didn't fight with anger. Even though he pushed you to the edge, you let karma do its work." It was then that Ava understood. This man was no ordinary visitor. He wasn't a neighbor. He wasn't a stranger. He was something else. He was the messenger. Man told, "You thought karma was just a quiet force, a natural law that would find its own way, but sometimes karma needs a little help. Sometimes it needs a guide, a reminder that balance can't always wait for the world to figure it out on its own." Ava told, "What are you saying?" Man, "I'm saying that what you did, that quiet unspoken act of letting karma take its course, you've started something. you've set a chain of events in motion, and now it's time to finish what you started. Karma had started to unfold, and now Ava had a choice to embrace this strange visitor's words or to walk away, leaving the balance of things in the hands of fate. The question remained, how far would she let this journey take her? Man told, "I'll be watching, Ava, and when the time comes, you'll know what to do." The morning light, so often a symbol of hope, now seemed to carry a certain heaviness, a sense that something monumental was about to unfold. Ava stood at her window, unable to shake the feeling that the balance of her life and of the neighborhood was about to shift in ways she couldn't predict. Mr. Jensen, once the proud and unyielding figure in the neighborhood, was no longer the man he had been. The cracks were showing, the small, almost invisible signs of his unraveling were becoming more apparent with each passing day. It wasn't just the damage to his fence, or the car trouble, or the strange leaks in his roof. No, this was something deeper. His own actions, those that had been built on bitterness and anger, were now starting to take their toll. For the first time in a long while, Mr. Jensen began to feel something he hadn't known in years. Fear, not the fear of being punished, but the fear that everything he had worked to maintain, everything he had tried to control, was slipping from his grasp, and he couldn't stop it. Ava had made her choice. She would no longer be the passive observer watching karma unfold from the sidelines. She had been nudged by something greater, something powerful, and now, as she watched Mr. Jensen go about his day, there was a strange sense of anticipation building within her. It was as though she were standing at the edge of a cliff, watching the final pieces fall into place. The figure standing silently at the end of the street was impossible to ignore. Mr. Jensen, despite his usual dismissive attitude, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This stranger, with his dark coat and piercing gaze, seemed to be staring directly at him, as though waiting for something, waiting for him. The figure standing silently at the end of the street was impossible to ignore. Mr. Jensen, despite his usual dismissive attitude, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This stranger, with his dark coat and piercing gaze, seemed to be staring directly at him, as though waiting for something, waiting for him. It was as if the universe had brought this strange visitor back into the picture for a reason. But what was that reason? What did it mean? For Mr. Jensen, every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, to keep moving forward. But there was something about that figure that held him in place, like a magnetic force drawing him closer and closer to a truth he wasn't ready to face. And there it was, the first sign, the first piece in a much larger game that was unfolding around him. His car, the one he had driven with such confidence for years, now refused to move. The power had gone out completely, and no matter how hard he tried to start it again, nothing would happen. The world seemed to close in around him. The street, once so familiar, now felt foreign, hostile. And all the while, the man in the black coat stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something, waiting for him to make a move. This was it. Mr. Jensen, for all his arrogance and pride, was about to feel what it was like to be powerless, to be vulnerable, to have the world push back against him in ways he couldn't control. Man in black coat, calmly, as if delivering a message from beyond. You've taken more than you gave, you've hurt and you've broken, and now the time has come for the scales to be balanced. The balance was tipping, and Mr. Jensen had no choice but to watch as karma, both the universe's and his own, sought its reckoning. The time for retribution had arrived, and Mr. Jensen would learn in that moment the true cost of his actions, the cost of hate, of cruelty, of looking down upon others. He had never known what it felt like to be at the mercy of something greater than himself, but now he was about to learn. Karma had a way of returning to those who least expected it, and for Mr. Jensen, that return was more than just a simple twist of fate. It was a lesson he would never forget. The days following his car's breakdown had been anything but normal. Mr. Jensen could no longer deny it. He had tried, as he always did, to ignore the signs, dismiss them as coincidences, as unlucky breaks. But today there was no mistaking it. Karma had come knocking at his door, and it was impossible to pretend anymore that he was exempt from its reach. But control, Mr. Jensen was beginning to realize, was a fleeting illusion. No matter how much he tried to assert his dominance over the world around him, the forces at play were bigger than him, bigger than anything he had ever understood, and the more he resisted, the more those forces seemed to push back. His hand trembles as he reaches for the envelope, his fingers brushing against the paper. It's heavier than it should be, thicker, almost as if there were something more inside than just a letter. As he tears it open, a sense of dread fills him, tightening around his chest. This wasn't an ordinary letter, this was something else. The letter begins cold and direct. Mr. Jensen, your actions have not gone unnoticed. Your disregard for others, your treatment of those you deem inferior, has set into motion a chain of events that cannot be undone. The time has come for you to face the consequences. Karma does not forget, and neither do those you've wronged. You are being watched, it has already begun. The words on that letter weren't just a warning, they were a revelation. For all the times Mr. Jensen had brushed aside the concept of karma, dismissed it as some myth or superstition, he was now living proof that the universe didn't forget. He was now the one in its crosshairs. Eva had been watching, waiting. She knew, deep down, that karma was never a quick fix. It didn't strike immediately or without reason, but it was methodical, persistent, and now she could see it happening. She could see Mr. Jensen's fears slowly consuming him inch by inch. It wasn't just the letter, nor the strange events that had been unfolding in his life. No, this was much bigger than that. Karma was unfolding in real time. It was watching him, observing his every move, waiting for him to make his next mistake. And no matter what he did, no matter how much he tried to fight it, he couldn't escape the consequences of his past actions. It wasn't just the letter, it wasn't just the strange occurrences. Number karma had come knocking once again, and this time it wasn't going to leave until it had delivered its full message. Man in black coat told, "It's time to face the truth, Mr. Jensen, time to face what you've done. You thought you could hurt others without consequence, that your actions would go unpunished, but karma doesn't forget, and now it has come to collect." The moment had come, the moment when Mr. Jensen had to face the full force of what he had done. The damage, the hatred, the cruelty, it all came rushing at him at once, and there was nowhere left to hide. Karma had finally caught up with him, and now he had no choice but to stand and face the truth of his actions. Man in black coat, softly but with a finality. You can't undo what you've done, but you can learn from it, and that is the only redemption you will find. For Mr. Jensen, there would be no more hiding, no more pretending. Karma had struck harder than he could have ever imagined, and now he had to face the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. The universe had delivered its judgment, and now there was no turning back. Karma had struck, and it wasn't finished yet. The weight of the world was pressing down on Mr. Jensen. For the first time, he truly understood the power of karma, not as some abstract idea, but as a living, breathing force that had been slowly closing in on him. The man in the black coat had come and gone, leaving behind a cold chill in the air and a message that was impossible to ignore. Every action had consequences. Every word, every sneer, every thoughtless judgment had set something in motion, something he could no longer control. He had spent so much of his life believing that power, wealth, and influence were the keys to everything. But now it was clear that the scales of life were not balanced by money or strength. No, they were balanced by something far greater, something Mr. Jensen had never fully respected or understood: empathy, humility, kindness, and now it was too late to change. The messages on his phone were coming in faster now, urgent and full of questions. But Mr. Jensen barely glanced at them. What good would it do to respond? The truth of the matter was that his past had caught up with him, and no text, no call, no amount of pleading could change the fact that karma was now calling the shots. The house seemed to groan under an unseen pressure, as though it too were aware of the reckoning unfolding within its walls. Mr. Jensen's heart races. The noises are louder now, echoing from the walls like the sound of something or someone moving in the dark. His first instinct is to run, to escape, but there's nowhere to go. The weight of his decisions has cornered him, trapping him in a place where there is no exit, no relief. And then, just as he's about to close the door and retreat back inside, something catches his eye, something small, barely noticeable at first. A slip of paper resting against the edge of the doorstep. His pulse quickens as he reaches down and picks it up, feeling a sense of dread creep up his spine. He unfolds the paper, his hands trembling as he reads the words. You cannot outrun what you've done. The consequences are already in motion. You will face your truth. It was happening. Karma was no longer a shadow in his life. It was a force, a tide that had begun to roll through everything he had built, and now there was no stopping it. The world he had known, the power he had relied on, was unraveling around him. No amount of money, no amount of influence could keep him from the consequences of his past. Karma had come not as a visitor but as a storm, tearing through his life with unrelenting force. It was impossible to ignore now. Every part of him, the man he was, the man he had tried to be, was crumbling, slipping through his fingers like sand. He couldn't control it, he couldn't stop it, and then, just when he thought he could take no more, he hears the voice that had haunted his thoughts, that had driven him to the edge of madness. You thought you could escape, didn't you? You thought you could outrun your own actions, but you can't. You're still here, Mr. Jensen, and karma has found you. The man in the black coat had returned, but this time it was different. There was no more mystery, no more games. The time for explanations had passed. Karma had reached its crescendo, and now Mr. Jensen was at the center of it all. Man told the scales are balanced. Your time is up, and then silence. The storm had passed, but the damage was done. Karma had struck with a force Mr. Jensen could never have imagined. In the end, karma doesn't just come for the guilty, it comes for the blind, for the arrogant, for those who think they can escape the truth. For Mr. Jensen, the final play had been made, and the price had been paid. Do you believe in karma? Have you ever felt the weight of your past actions coming back to you? Let us know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of justice. Don't miss what's coming next.